you can feel lower frequencies much more easily than you can feel higher frequencies. The effectiveness of this becomes much less sensitive at the higher frequencies than the skin inside your ear.
Dr. Castro, going back into your dissertation, so far we talked about sound as radiation and the concept that you can actually feel sound. But I'm curious, what are the limitations of actually feeling sound, right? Like, what I know of feeling sound is things like haptics in a controller. I've seen wearable vests where you can feel sound, but like, what are the limitations there, and what is that exists right now?
They claim that you can feel sound, and I was very dismayed when, my own background being hard of hearing and trying to access as much as music as possible, and someone comes around, they say, hey, you can feel sound. I'm thinking, I remember what that feels like when I was on stage as an orchestra, relying on the fact that I could feel these big sound waves in order to feel sound. And imagine my disappointment when it was just a little pack that rumbled, and I was like, it's cool, but it's not what I was expecting, right? And it turns out it's really difficult to do that, and it's really easy to feel lower frequencies because of the way that our cells in your skin and the cells in your muscles are tuned to perceive different types of stimulus, right? Evolutionarily, we have developed a certain mechanical vibration bandwidth in our hands, or sorry, not our hands, but in our skin and muscles to avoid danger. If there's a bear coming your way, you better feel that or you're gonna die. So you need to detect it as quickly and as efficiently as possible and get out of the way. Our ears formed so we can have a 3D perception of the world, so you can hear the bear coming before you feel it, and you can get out of the way. So obviously, our bodies have evolutionarily been designed for survivability, and now that music comes into the fray, music is not necessarily a thing that has been an existential threat to the human nature. So it kind of has to fit with whatever we've been given or what we've evolved to. But the limitations in feeling sound, it doesn't mean that whatever you were using the same signal you give to a speaker to be able to hear what we understand as sound is not the same signal you can give to the body and have it expect to hear sound the same way or experience music the same way. Taking just music as an example, there's this idea of like flat, right? In order to hear everything balanced and not to have too bassy or too harsh or something like that, there's this idea of a balanced curve, right? Where we've mapped out how humans perceive different frequencies and the intensity of different frequencies. We know that we hear certain frequencies like a baby crying much more intensely than something like a car driving by. And because of that, we're able to understand what is called a flat curve. Basically, it's not biased towards any different ways. It's impossible to have it perfectly, but say for the sake of argument. The feeling spectra is that. That is the flat curve of feeling. You can feel lower frequencies much more easily than you can feel higher frequencies. The effectiveness of this becomes much less sensitive at the higher frequencies than the skin inside your ear, your eardrum. So, that's just a matter of how these meat bags called human beings have evolved. And it's kind of the stuff that we were given. But unfortunately, that does mean it's more difficult to perceive higher frequency vibrations than it is lower frequency vibrations. And that's just a fact of how we're built.
Got it. So we can feel sound as humans, right? But the reality is that there are still limitations to feeling sound.
Right.
But there are certain ways that you can offset that and actually give more access and more ranges to people, which we'll dive deeper into your dissertation as you talk about that. But what exists currently is really not taking advantage of that whole range. They're really just taking advantage of the easy part, what you can really just feel right off the bat. And it's still not a one-to-one replica of sound. It's really just a certain frequency range that they're pushing vibrational energy as much as possible to portray that.
Exactly, or to get some semblance of it. And so I guess another way to explain this is to explain a certain research that's been done at University of Southern California's Bionic Ears Lab by Dr. Ray Goldsworthy and his team over there. They're trying to figure out if it's possible to have cochlear implant users, people whose hearing, they're either profoundly deaf or they were hearing and they became deaf, and they're a good candidate for a cochlear implant. Cochlear implant is essentially a device that is implanted in the back of your head, and then it's tapped into your auditory nerve, and then it takes that information, or as close as possible to the ear, to replicate how the nerve gets stimulated from sound. So it's a microphone, it's a processor. The microphone's on the outside of the ear. It sends it magnetically inside the head where there's the implant, and the implant then sends those magnetic informations and relays them as electrical information to touch the nerves, and the nerves then stimulates the brain like it would normally if it came from the eardrum. It does mean that you permanently lose your hearing as a cochlear implant, so it's kind of an irreversible process. And the interesting thing is that from what I understand, I don't have a cochlear implant, and I've only talked to people who do, and people who do have a cochlear implant aren't people that have a normal sense of hearing anymore. So it's kind of hard to have a one-to-one conversation about what that experience is like. But from what we're able to glean, or what I'm able to glean off of it, is that it's kind of like a vocoder, where if you're saying something, it doesn't, in order to stay low power and very lightweight, it can't have a lot of it can't use a lot of data. It can't use a lot of power, because then you have to have a battery, and the battery just adds weight to the whole thing. It's very uncomfortable. So in order to stay super lightweight, it uses very few frequencies to recreate that sound. Their entire experience of sound, high frequencies, low frequencies, the bear growling and then a teapot boiling, is all reduced to like 24 something bands of sound, and they're like resynthesizing those, right? So it's not like it's not a microphone to going directly to your head. It's kind of like, hey, this is what someone is saying, and we can have enough frequency bands or enough kind of like peaks here to recreate the speech that you're saying, so that way we can give you at least an idea or an impression of speech. It's not designed for music. To communicate with people is kind of what the hope is, and to keep it nice and lightweight, you just can't replicate the entire bandwidth of music. So it's really difficult to get a sense of what's happening. So the lab at USC was looking at if it was possible to use tactile information to give back beat information, or stuff that's happening, 4 on the floor. That doesn't come through the cochlear implant, because every time the kick happens or the snare happens, it's activating one of those 24 bands. And so it's not something that you're like, okay, I hear the beat. Is it bass or is it beat? Think about it. What's the difference between a drum and a bass line? When you break them down and you look at the same waveform, they look very similar. And so that's really difficult to understand the nuance and differences between it unless you have the entirety of the frequency range to get about it. So obviously they were looking at tactile as a way to be able to get some of that information back, but we ran into the same problems again. The human body is just not designed to be able to reproduce the entire frequency range, and at the time they didn't have a device that was able to reproduce high bandwidth vibrational information to be able to attempt to collect that information from a song. So it was something that was a really cool idea, and something that I think is something that they should continue to look into. And now that we have the technology, perhaps we can work with them again and try to look into that. But yeah.
So there's limitations there, but there's a lot of opportunity there because of the existing limitations that exist in feeling sound.
Yes.
Awesome.